So we'll just, because there's people always logging on at different times, we'll just say hi to those people who've just logged on, and hi to those guys in Gippsland who've said hello to us. We are live at an interschool competition today here at Trinity Grammar School. This is the competition that we're running at the moment. This is the list of the teams that are here, and all of these students who are playing in the competition are sitting in front of us as a live studio audience today. At the moment, we've got two teams equal with 11 points. We've got Grimwade House with 13 points, Blackburn Grammar. Two teams equal with 15 in third place, Camberwell and Trinity. 17 points, Balwyn North, which is a bit of a coup. They were in third place last, and now they're up to second place. So good work, Balwyn North. And Greythorn, the arch enemies of Balwyn North Primary School, arch enemies, they've been battling it out for years, are in first place with 18 points, just in front. There's still a couple of games going as we speak, so we don't have all of the scores in yet. We'll update that again for you at the end of the competition. At the end of the lesson, we'll have an idea of where everyone's up to. So the lesson that we're going to be doing today is about endgames. All right? And here we have an endgame position. One of the things I've noticed, put scores in later. One of the things I've noticed walking around and watching a lot of the games today is that lots of these games are finishing up in endgames. And they're finishing in endgames because they're really close matches. So if you're playing someone who's easy and you've got a lot of experience, you can finish them off in the opening or even the middle game. If you're a really good player and you make a mistake in the opening, that's not so bad. You can always make a comeback in the middle game. If you make a mistake in the middle game, that's okay. You can make a comeback in the end game. The end game is so important because if you make a mistake in the end game, that's it. There's no time to come back. All right? It's the one time of the game where people are usually got less concentration because they've been playing a long game, so they're getting tired, but it's the most important part of the game because there's no making a comeback from there. All right? I've had plenty of games in my chess career where I've made a blunder in the opening or the middle game. I'm 2 pawns down or a piece down, and I get into an end game and make a comeback in the end game. So you've got to be really good at the end game. That's the best plan. Okay? Good strategy to be good at the end game. All right, here we have an end game situation. It is white's turn to move here, and we've only got a few pawns and a rook and a king each. Obviously, you've always got a king, but you've only got a few pawns and a rook each. Now, this is the most common of all end games. The most common of all end games is rook and pawn end games. All right, does anyone know what is the main strategy in the end game? What are you aiming for? If there was just one thing you were aiming for in the end game, what is it? To promote a pawn. Exactly right. Exactly right. Above all else, the end game is a situation where you don't have many pieces left. Your queen's gone. Your opponent's queen's gone. So the main aim in the end game is to get a pawn to the end and get a queen back. Right? What's the easiest type of pawn to get to the end and get a new queen with? A passed pawn. Very good. So a passed pawn is a pawn that has got no enemy pawns anywhere in front of it. So have a look at this pawn in the middle of the board that I've highlighted green. That we would call a passed pawn because all of the lines in front of that pawn are empty. So this pawn can just move, move, move through to the end of the board really easily. Okay? It's a passed pawn. There's no enemy pawns that can stop it. Okay? Passed pawn's all about enemy pawns. Okay, so it's that's our passed pawn. In this position here, it's actually going to be hard for that pawn to get through to the end of the board. So let's say that white moves his pawn forwards on his first move. Let's just clear all those colours off. If white moves the pawn forwards, it's really easy for black to stop that passed pawn. So from a defensive point of view in the endgame, what's the best way to defend against a passed pawn? There's two things you can do. What's one of them? Enoch. Okay, so the first thing with your rook, get your rook behind the pawn. So in this situation, black could play rook across here, behind the pawn. Now, anywhere that pawn moves forwards, it's going to get taken by the rook all the time. Okay? So the best way to defend a passed pawn, if you've got a rook, is to put your rook behind the pawn. Let's say that he didn't want to use his rook. What's another way to defend a passed pawn? Use the king, and where would you put the king? on the side of the passed pawn, behind the passed pawn. Again. Okay, Mark, what do you think? In front of the passed pawn is what we're looking for. So if black can either play rook behind the passed pawn, which is the best defense for a rook, going behind the pawn, or he can play king to f8, and then next move, king to e7, and his king is in front of the pawn. Two best defenses, rook behind or king in front. Why are they so good? Because anywhere that the pawn tries to move forwards, if the rook's behind it, it's going to get taken. If the king's in front of it, the pawn's actually blocked. It can't move any further forwards. It's blocked, and the king's also attacking that pawn. So when we go back to the start position, we see that even though white has a passed pawn at the moment, it's not that easy for that pawn to get through to the end of the board, because black's got some good defensive resources. He can put the rook behind or the king in front. So, what's white going to do? White thinks about where else could he get a passed pawn. Right? And when we think about it, we see white's got 3 pawns on that side of the board against black's 2. On the other side of the board, black's got 3 against white's 2. Okay, let's make them yellow. All right, so it's 3 against 2 for white on the queen side, 3 against 2 for black on the king side. That gives you a clue. Well, that gives white a clue in this game. White should be trying to get another passed pawn on the queen side, on the A, B or C files. Because those pawns on the queen side, he's got 3 against 2. So he could trade off pawn for pawn. Then he could trade off pawn for pawn. And then he's got 1 passed pawn, which can go all the way through to the end of the board. So that's his plan. Get a passed pawn on the queen side. The first move that white plays is pawn to h5. Just trying to muck up black's pawns on this side of the board. Okay, trying to muck up black's pawns on this side of the board. It also gives black a chance to win a pawn for nothing. Okay, it's not by taking the pawn, because if you take the pawn, that's not a free pawn. White can take this one back. That's the equal trade of pawn for pawn. Who can see how black can win a pawn for nothing? How can he win a pawn for nothing? Can you see it, Tim, from there? Move around so you can see how black can win a pawn for free. Completely free pawn.
He can take the pawn which is on the C. Yes,
yep, that's not a free pawn, because if he takes that pawn, white will take him back. That's just a pawn for pawn. So how do we get a pawn for nothing? We want to get a free pawn. If you do pawn takes pawn, we already saw that black would lose his f pawn. You could do rook takes pawn. Mark. Very good. Rook h4, check. Now, white's in check. He's got to move his king, and then black gets to take a pawn for nothing. So that's what black did. But white wanted black to do that. Because now instead of black's rook being in a really good position right in the middle of the board, black's rook has moved out into a pretty bad position on the edge of the board. The endgame, you've got hardly any pieces left. White's got a rook and a king, black's got a rook and a king. It's important that each of your pieces gets into the best possible position. So rooks on open files. In the endgame, the main lesson from this that I want you to take home, the main thing I've noticed in your games that you're playing today that's gone wrong, is your king doesn't come into the attack enough. In the endgame, you actually want your king to be right in the middle of the board. Right? If white could have his king in the middle of the board here, he's won already. This pawn can just zoom down the board, it'll be protected by his king. This king could come in front, march down and take these pawns. White would be thrashing. You've got to get your king into the attack. If you leave your king in the back of the board or in the corner, you're wasting half your army. It's like at the start of the game, leaving all your knights and bishops on the back row. You've got to get your king into the attack. And in this game, that sacrifice of a pawn that white did was actually so that his king could get chased closer to the middle of the board. And he's going to find a way for his king to come into the middle of the board quicker than black's king can come into the middle of the board. And whoever's king is in a more attacking position in the endgame, that's the person that wins the game. Right? So really important lesson when you're playing an endgame, get your king into the attack. Let's see what happens. First, white gets his rook into a good position. Rook to d2. Now, we know about rooks. Rooks need to go on open files. And open files are row up and down the board with no pawns on it. Okay, put scores in later. All right, we'll just leave that closed. We can put scores in later. Come sit down. All right, so white's got this beautiful open file for his rook. If we go back at the start of the game, it was completely opposite. Black had his rook in an awesome position on this open file, controlling the whole board. And then after that little sacrifice, black's like, hey, yeah, free pawn. Now white is the one with his rook in this really powerful position in the middle of the board. Okay? So black's plan with taking that pawn is backfiring on him. He's a pawn ahead, but his rook's in a bad position, and it's let white get his rook into an excellent position in the middle of the board. All right, let's see what black plays now. Trying to get his rook back into the game. All right, so his rook's planning to come across this way and maybe take out that pawn. And that actually works into white's long-term plan. Remember at the start of the game we said that white's got 3 pawns here against 2, so he wants to try and get a pass pawn on that side of the board. Any idea what you might do if you were white in this position? What a good move for white would be here? Right? If you're good at rook endgames, you should know what you want to do here.
I think it should be rook d7.
Rook d7. Great move. That's the same move as the Grandmaster played in this game. Rook d7, ignoring this pawn that was being attacked. Just ignoring it. He's like, yeah, whatever. Take another pawn if you want to. So black says, thanks very much, I will. So black's just taken 2 pawns for nothing. But what has white got for that? He's got his rook into an absolute killer position. This rook is an electric fence. It locks the king onto the back row. So now for the rest of the game, black's king can't come into the attack. Black can't join in the attack now. Black's king's completely out of it. White's king, that can just march up, take out all of these enemy pawns. White's king's in the game, no problems later. So having an extra king attacking, that's worth about 4 points. Right? This king being locked on the back row gives white an advantage of about 4 points. It's like having a whole extra knight or bishop, right? And a pawn. That's how important having the king into the attacking position would be. So white's rook is now in a great position, and white does rook takes pawn, taking out one of the pawns to make it even easier to get one of these 3 pawns through to the end of the board. Because now it's only 3 against 1. 3 against 1. He should be able to get a passed pawn and get a queen with one of those ones. Right? Black also has got 3 against 1. Right? No one said this was going to be an easy victory because it's 3 against 1 on one side, 3 against 1 on the other. The big advantage is white's king is going to be able to stop those pawns. Right? Remember the strategies. How do you block a passed pawn? King goes in front, rook goes behind. Well, white's rook can come behind easily because it's already behind the pawns. White's king can come in front of the pawns easily because he's already in front of the pawns. And black is going to find it harder to get his rook behind the passed pawns over there and very hard to get his king all the way over there to block those passed pawns. So let's see what black tries. G5. All right, he's pushing forwards with those pawns to try and get a passed pawn of his own. White does pawn to b4, pawn to g4, so advancing these pawns. King goes forwards. This is the most dangerous pawn for black. That's the one that's most likely to get through because there's nothing in front of it, only to the side. So white brings his king a little bit more into the attack, stops the rook from coming down, and if this pawn ever tries to go forwards, well, white's king's already there defending it, blocking it off. Black puts his rook down here, so black's trying the same strategy as white, right? Electric fence here, keeping the king locked off on the back row, but for white, it's on the back 2 rows. Right? Black's locked on the very back line. Right? The only place that black can go with his king is somewhere, well, not even in the corner, just somewhere along there. Whereas white, well, white's got 2 rows that he can move on. Yeah? White's got a bit more space for his king to maneuver. All right, white's next move, pawn to a4. We can see what's happening here. He's trying to get a passed pawn on that side of the board. Pawn forwards check, forcing the king back. That's all right. Rook goes up here to attack this pawn. And now it's time for white to start getting some passed pawns. So white does, in the game, rook to c7, protecting his pawn. But what he could have done, and probably should have done, was actually moving his pawn forwards to a5, getting a passed pawn. Okay? Getting a passed pawn now. And then, let's say, for example, pawn takes pawn. This pawn is looking pretty good, this b pawn. Push, push, push. It's going to be a queen in just a few moves. Black can take, push. Can't go behind the pawn, unfortunately, because if you go behind the pawn, let's just show you, pawn goes forwards. Then next move, check. When the king moves out of check, pushes forwards, turns into a queen protected by his rook. Right? If he doesn't want to be checked, he moves his king out of the way. Then pawn discovered check, and the queen's now covering the back row. So that would have been probably an easier way to win. White's gone for a bit more defence. He's played, instead of a5, he's played in the game rook c7 to try and protect his pawn here, which is just not as quick a victory. It's still going to be a victory because white's got his passed pawn on this edge of the board that can come through, trade off the pawn, and one of these pawns here is going to get to be a passed pawn. Let's see what black puts up a bit more of a fight. Same plan for black, trying to get pawns forwards to get a passed pawn. But white gets there first. Pawn forwards to a5, and now no matter what, white's going to have a passed pawn. If black takes it, white's got a passed pawn. If he doesn't take it, pawn goes forwards, and it's through to get a queen. So black does pawn takes pawn, and white pushes this pawn forwards to get a passed pawn. This pawn in 1, 2, 3 more moves has got a queen. The reason he wanted to go pawn forwards here instead of pawn takes pawn is that now those pawns aren't protecting each other. So black could play rook across and rook across, get his rook behind the pawn, and it'd be a bit easier to defend. But when you do pawn forwards here, you've always got the 2 pawns protecting each other. Black keeps on going. He's trying to get a passed pawn. At the moment, no passed pawn, because no matter which pawn comes forwards, it's always stopped by white's pawn. If this one comes forwards, it's stopped by white's pawn. If the G pawn tries to go forwards, it's blocked. So there's no passed pawn yet. White's pawn only 2 more steps to the end, and finally black says, hey, I can get a passed pawn. Pawn to h3, sacrificing that pawn. So now passed pawn, passed pawn. White's got his passed pawns as well. Passed pawn, passed pawn. Can you see the difference though? That white's king is already there blocking the pawns off. King in front of the pawns. Black's king is nowhere near to defence. So white's pawns are going to get through in this game. Pawn forwards, pawn forwards. 1 more step, he's got a queen. Check. King up. Check. Takes the pawn. Letting black get his queen. Because when white gets a queen, it's check. There's only one thing black can do to block. And then it's checkmate. So white's pawns were able to get through first because he got passed pawns and he used the passed pawns. Well, the passed pawns were harder to defend because black's king wasn't anywhere near them to join in the game. All right, we're going to have a quick look at another endgame position. We're going to have a look at this endgame position here. All right, seems pretty even. 6 pawns, 6 pawns, and a king each. So who's going to win? Black's going to win? Why is black going to win? Nothing. Okay, so white's pawns... Yep. So white's got 3 pawns that are a little bit weak. Maybe even this pawn that is a bit weak as well. So he's got 3 pawn islands, 3 groups of pawns, which makes his pawns a bit weaker. Black's pawns are in a much better formation. None of them have moved forwards. The further your pawns move forwards, the weaker they become. The easier they are to get taken. So here, white's got 3 weak pawns. So if black's going to win this game, it's black's turn to move now, which pawn should black attack to try and win this game? The H pawn. Okay, so you're saying don't attack the weak pawns here or here, but instead attack the H pawn. Now, what black thought about in this position before he did his move was, how am I going to get my king into the attack? And he's got a lot of options. He can bring his king forwards this way, into the attack here, and try and take out that pawn. After he moves his king forwards, he could bring his king forwards this way, and try and get in this way to take out that pawn. Or he can move his king forwards this way, and then take out that pawn. So he's got a few choices. He's got to think about what white's going to do to defend. Now, if white's king wants to defend this pawn, it can do it in one move. If he wants to stop the king coming through the middle, he can do it in probably 2 moves. To defend the pawn on the side of the board, whoa, it's a long way away, isn't it? So he says, well, which plan is going to be the quickest for me to attack and the slowest for the opponent to attack? Well, it's pretty obvious. The H pawn, the one that you suggested, this pawn here, definitely is the one to go for. And that's exactly what black played here, was just an attack on that H pawn. The other good thing about it, if you take that H pawn, black has a passed pawn. Yeah? Black's H pawn here can just zoom straight down to the end of the board. If you take out one of the other pawns, I don't know, maybe you take out the A pawn, there's still no passed pawn. This pawn tries to move forwards, it gets taken. So it doesn't even give you a passed pawn straight away. It's good, you might get an extra pawn, but you still don't have a passed pawn. You don't have a pawn that's got a clear path all the way through to the end of the board. So let's see how this game worked. Now that you see what they were thinking about, let's see how this game actually went. So black played king f6, and you can see his plan is to come up and take out that H pawn. White sees that straight away and says, well, hang on a second, I've got to protect that pawn. So he runs his king across to defend that pawn. Just in time. He's defended it. Phew. All right, so now he's protected the pawn. So, how's black going to win? He went for the attack. The pawn was attacked, but it was defended. Well, let's see what he does. He first just starts pushing his pawns forwards a little bit. He's got his king way in front of the pawns, so moving his pawn forwards isn't going to weaken his pawns because his king's already there to protect them. Now, white, what's white going to do? White's in a bit of trouble. If he moves his king away from the pawn, it's gone. So he really has to keep his king on one of those 2 squares, doesn't he, to protect that weak pawn. So black can do whatever he wants, and for the rest of the game, white's king has just got to go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, because he can't risk moving away because he loses that pawn. Once that pawn's gone, black's got a passed pawn, he can get a queen. So black takes his time advancing his pawns forwards, and you can see that white's king just stays there. The other thing to notice, this pawn here, this B pawn, is a great pawn because it's one pawn that blocks out 2 of your opponent's pawns. We don't even need to use that pawn on the A file. It's got 1 pawn blocking 2. So that's a really good strategy there. So black's just calmly moving his pawns forwards, and white's just sitting around, well, really can't do anything. Just moving his king backwards and forwards. Black still has to get a passed pawn. Okay? And he's going to use the fact that his king is way more attacking than his opponent's king to do that. So he starts off by starting an exchange of some pawns. All right, so it's a swap off of pawn for pawn. Now, white's played pawn here with a little trick. Endgames, like I said, there's no coming back. If black plays, hey, look, I can take a pawn, now white wins the game. Pawn takes back, and now white's pawn straight through to the end of the board. So you've got to be so careful that one bad move can lose the game for you. White's got that little trick. Black doesn't fall for it. Black takes the pawn to make sure that there's no passed pawns. White takes them back. No passed pawns. Pawn goes forwards. Black's not going to be able to create a passed pawn here because it's 2 against 2. But don't worry, he's not going for the passed pawn straight away. He's swapping these ones off to get his king into a more attacking position. Now, in this game here, White actually resigned the game. Because he was playing, Black was a guy called Akiba Rubinstein, who was the number 2 player in the whole world. Right? And if you're playing against the number 2 player in the world, and you look at this, you're like, there's no way I can win this game. But we want to see why, or what would have happened from here. So, after that pawn trade, pawn for pawn, Black's king has basically got free reign to do whatever he wants. Because the king is covering all of these squares. That's the good thing about having your king in the attack. Not only is your king more into the attack, but it also means that your opponent's king can't come anywhere near you. So what can White do? Well, he's got to try and run all the way around the king. And Black will say, no way, you're not going to run around me. King's got to move, then we can grab that pawn. King can try and block that pawn off. Okay, you can try and block that pawn off by staying in front of the pawn. And White can even do a sacrifice. He can even sacrifice this pawn and go over and munch up the other pawns on the side of the board. Sacrificing his passed pawn and munching that one. Now he's got 2 passed pawns to get through the end of the board. All right? So having the king in a more attacking position means that you're holding your opponent's king out of it, and your king can actually do the power of, well, it's worth 4 points. It's a really powerful attacking piece. All right, so in your endgames, we've seen a few things in the endgames here. We've seen in the first one, rook behind pawn for defense, king in front of pawn for defense. And we've seen for the attacking player, if you get your king into the attack, then there's nothing your opponent can do. Black's got all these squares covered. We call that a runway. And then this pawn is just going to march. And then nothing can stop him just continuing down the runway and getting into a queen. All right? And so Black's just going to get his pawn to the end, get a queen. And, of course, everybody should know how to do a checkmate with a king and a queen against the king. All right, so endgames, number 1, as soon as you lose your queen, as soon as your opponent's lost their queen, it's an endgame, race your king into the middle of the board. Get your king to be an attacking piece. All right, guys, that's it for today. We're going to go back to our tournament. Thanks for everybody who was